Hi everyone, it's Sarah. We're just going to walk through the main key components with regards to the theories of specifically of Florence Nightingale and Hildegard Peplau, specifically looking at their backgrounds, the key components of their theories, and how they actually apply to nursing practice. So again, what we're going to focus on here is really understand and apply some of the key concepts found in these theoretical frameworks and looking at, again, that intersection of nursing history with nursing knowledge development and really focusing on, again, the history and the backgrounds of these two specific nursing theorists. So, of course, Florence Nightingale is considered really the modern theorist, if you will, our first nursing theorist, and really kind of provides the background and the foundation for nursing as a profession. As you no doubt saw within her background, she really had quite a phenomenal background, considering the age in which she lived. Yes, her family was well off, but was really quite significant was the fact that her father in particular really believed in education for girls and tutored her in all these different philosophies and higher order levels of thinking. That was completely unheard of back in the day. She felt that nursing was a religious calling. They mentioned in the text that she felt or shared that God spoke to her on 4 different occasions about nursing as a calling and about her need to go out and assist with other individuals, which led her then to go off and further her education, but also, again, the work that she did, which is really her foundational piece in the Crimean War, where she really started to really emphasize and use that particular notion about data and the environment and the impact that it actually had on mortality rates for the soldiers. So her theory development, and so when you look back at her background and what led her to nursing, and again, if we talk about what is theory, theory is a way of coming to an understanding of the patterns and the observations that we see. So if you look at it, think about very clearly, perhaps take a moment and what were her observations about health, the patterns that she saw regarding health. And I'll lead you to take a look at the introducing the theory on page 44, where she says very specifically, in watching disease both in private homes and public hospitals, the thing which strikes the experienced observer most forcefully is this, that the symptoms or the sufferings generally considered to be inevitable and incident to the disease are very often not symptoms of the disease at all, but of something quite different, of the want of fresh air, or light, or of warmth, or of quiet, or of cleanliness, or punctuality and care in the administration of diet for each or all of these. So again, she's saying it's not about the disease, it's about what is actually causing that. And I really thought that was a nice way of really focusing on in terms of what she saw as really the key component of her environmental theory. This is, again, as we also know, and again, for you, those of you who are also taking your stats courses as well, that Florence she was our first statistician. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at this particular link. I'm not sure if the link will work on the slide deck as it goes, but take a look at the link. It's a very short link. It really talks about her background as she grew up as a little girl and her fascination with data and the observations she even had as a small child. But if the link doesn't work, just go to YouTube and literally look at Florence Nightingale, The Joy of Stats, and I think you'll really, really appreciate the nuances and, again, the significant role that her observations had in terms of actually using statistical analysis. So she noted very clearly, just as a short piece, that the vast majority of men in war were not dying because of battle wounds. They were dying because of the infections that they were acquiring in the hospital. And the work that she did in terms of looking at observations with regards to cleanliness of wards and nursing practices. So I really strongly suggest you have a peek at it. It's only about 2 minutes long. It's really, really good. So take a peek at that. That'll also give you some great insights into her ability to look at, again, observations and patterns, and then her ability to use data to actually develop that business case about how then hospital wards should be structured. So again, she's our first statistician, but also really demonstrating the importance of evidence-based practice and evidence-informed practice in order to facilitate change. What I also thought was really quite interesting was, as we talked about earlier, even last week about, there's the meta paradigm and then the paradigms, which are world views, that your text on page 45, in her world at that particular point in time, there were two conflicting world views. One that talked about the issue of contagions, and then Florence Nightingale's worldview, was more so much about anti-contagions. So the contagion piece, again, they describe it really quite nicely on page 45, where they talked about, contagionism, postulated that some diseases were communicable and spread in such a way. So therefore, the response to that was to quarantine everyone. Whereas Florence really looked at the whole notion of anti-contagionism that really postulated that disease resulted from local environmental sources. And, the clouds of routing filth that they talked about. So really, for her, the issue was not about quarantine. The issue was really about preventing the spread of disease, that you really just have to eliminate filth. So I thought this was a really great example about where, again, even in her day, there were two conflicting worldviews, and how she actually started to work towards that in terms of to facilitate not only, again, better population health, but again, also specifically the role for nursing in that. So Florence Nightingale's environmental theory is very clear. So the theoretical basis that she really talks about the interrelationships between health and the environment within nursing practice, and very specifically about the external influences that can actually prevent, suppress, or contribute to disease or death. The theory goal, again, she sees this, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the meta paradigm, that the role for nursing was really nurses were to help patients retain their own vitality by meeting their basic needs through controlling the environment. Very clearly, Florence Nightingale thought that the role of nurses was to put the patient in the best possible condition, to be reparative, to get healthy. And those best possible conditions was to make their environment cleansed, welcoming, and healing in nature. And the focus, just as I said, controlling the environment for the individuals, families, and communities, so that, again, if the environment's controlled, then those individuals can focus on health and wellness. These are the 5 components of her environmental health theory. And again, it's about clean air, pure water, effective drainage, which talks about sewage systems, runoffs, and things of that nature, cleanliness, and light. And I think that these, we seem to think that these are not important anymore these days, but we've seen recent examples where, again, even just think about what's happening now with Hurricane Florence, the availability of clean water, effective drainage systems and runoff systems and sewage systems and things of that nature. What I actually would like you to call upon to, as a bit of a reflective exercise, is to look at Nightingale's assumptions that are listed on page 50. And those 11 different assumptions and how they actually really speak about the importance of nursing education, that nursing is separate from medicine, looking at that as a very specific component. Nursing is both an empirical science and an art. The identification of nursing as a profession, very distinct from medicine, and really clarifying the focus of nursing. So I encourage you really to deeply reflect upon, again, those 11 underlying assumptions to her environmental theory and how they actually speak about not only the role for nursing in patient care or population health, but also the importance of them putting structure around nursing as a distinct profession that requires a unique body of knowledge. So Florence today, so how might those 5 components of this environmental health and the meta paradigm be actually applied to some of the issues that are really specific? So, if we were do this as an in-house in-class exercise, think about the impact of those 5 elements, and I'll just take you back to them here: having access to clean air, water, drainage, cleanliness, and light, and how that would actually impact, let's say, our homeless populations who don't have access to those types of things. Or again, the significant challenges faced by our northern indigenous communities in terms of having access to proper sewage systems and clean drinking water and clean, healthy environments that are free from such as mold and things of that nature. And again, even think about the unbelievable significant implications for individuals that are now dealing with the aftermaths of hurricanes and Hurricane Florence, and even the ongoing issues in terms of in Puerto Rico for the individuals that are dealing with a year later, the aftermath of Hurricane Maria as well. So, think about this again, consider this. If this was an exam question, what would be the risks to health and one strategy to address those health risks based on, these potential three categories: homelessness, indigenous communities, or individuals dealing with environmental disasters. How would Florence Nightingale approach these three distinct entities? Really looking at, in terms of nursing practice, environmental theory, again, she really talks about those 13 canons. So again, if you look at those on page 52 of your text, think about your current practice. And I think as nurses, we also need to think about our own practice. So how does our practice, either unconsciously, the nature of our activities and care delivery, really act as a barrier to optimal patient care and patient care outcomes? And one of the things I'll share with you is actually from Notes on Nursing, which is a great thing if you ever get a chance to read it. But she actually even speaks about, I'm just going to share with you now, she talks very specifically about noise and the importance of having a quiet environment and what that means for patients. Never allow a patient to be waked intentionally or accidentally is the goal of nursing. If he is roused out of his first sleep, he will almost certainly have no more sleep. It is a curious but quite intelligible fact that if a patient is awoken after a few hours instead of a few minutes, he is much more likely to sleep again. Unnecessary noise, or noise that creates an expectation in the mind, is that which hurts a patient. So again, she even spoke about those environmental pieces, even how do we create environmental stressors for patients? How loud are we sitting at that in the hallways or at nights? Does your hospital really dim the lights at night in the hallways, or is it still really, really quite bright? And how do we actually facilitate a nice, quiet, caring environment for our patients? So this is the meta paradigm that she draws upon. So this is Florence's take on the meta paradigm. So of course, again, the person is at the center of care. Health is a result of environmental factors, not just that absence of disease. And, the environment is the environment in which care is delivered. And again, how do we as nurses really control that environment so that individuals really can then be put in a state of actually being repaired, if you will. So again, I'm just going to share with you some of the things from her own words in terms of Notes on Nursing, where she talks about, to have the air within as pure as the air without it is not necessary, as it often appears to be thought as a cold. I know an intelligent, humane house surgeon who makes a practice of keeping the ward windows open. The physicians and surgeons invariably close them while doing their rounds, and the house surgeon very properly opens them whenever the doctors have turned their backs. Without a proper supply of windows and a proper supply of fuel in open fireplaces, fresh air is comparatively easy to secure when your patients are in bed. Never be afraid of open windows then. People don't catch cold in bed. This is a popular fallacy. With proper bedclothes and hot bottles, if necessary, you can always keep a patient warm in bed and still well ventilate them with open windows. One of her other thoughts is, a careful nurse will keep a constant watch over her sick, especially weak, protracted, and collapsed cases, to guard against the effects of a loss of vital heat by the patient himself. So keeping the patients warm. Cool air, not ventilation, nor fresh air in a method of chill. So again, the notion about keeping them fresh and aired. The other thing about night air, an extraordinary fallacy is the dread of night air. What air can we breathe at night but night air? The choice is between pure night air from without or foul night air from within. Most people prefer the latter, an unconscionable choice. So again, the whole notion about the environment and how that actually contributes to that from those different perspectives. And I think I'll actually, just close with this particular piece is about which of our existing CNO practice guidelines are really reflective of Nightingale's theory. Sorry, that's the dog. So think about that. So, you know, what are the practice guidelines from the College of Nurses that actually would be reflective of Florence Nightingale's theory? And our next theorist to consider is Hildegard Peplau, and she really focused on the nurse-patient relationship theory. So as you saw from her background, you know, when in the 1950s, you know, there were few educational paths open to women, and nursing was still actually taught. The education of nurses was still actually done by physicians. And nurses were seen as that handmaidens, if you will, to medicine, and really, you know, how much of a reflection that was of the social structure and overall society right now. So really, we have to thank Hildegard for really changing the trajectory of our profession and really identifying the significant role of nursing and even the role of advanced practice nurses. So as you saw from her background, her relationships with patients was really based on her practice of psychiatry and looking at the areas of mental health. So really looking at up into this point in time, and hopefully we've really seen significant changes, particularly in the area of psychiatry. Patients were always seen as the objects of care. We did to the patients, not with. And Peplau really insisted that nurses and patients really engaged in intersubjectivity in terms of really the connection between the two, and the two were actually not to be separate. She also really spoke about, particularly in the area of psychiatry, that nurses must really understand their own behavior to help others to identify their perceived difficulties. And when we think about that, particularly that last bullet point there, just stop and think about it for a second. Which ways of knowing actually applies here? The whole statement about nurses must understand their own behavior to help others to identify what their perceived difficulties might be. So take a moment just to think about which ways of knowing actually apply there. Central to Peplau's theory is really about the whole notion of patient-centered care or client-centered care, and she was really the first to coin these particular terms. And she saw that the nurse-patient relationship is really central to all nursing care, that without relationship, there can be no care. By putting the patient and family at the center of care, that we can actually improve our patient outcomes. And again, really speaking about that language that we are actually doing with clients rather than doing to them. She spoke about it again very clearly. If an interaction between a patient and a nurse has not gone well, the nurse's first response is to examine his or own behaviors. And again, this is a direct quote right out of your text on page 69. So again, perhaps take a moment and think about which ways of knowing actually apply here within that statement about if an interaction between yourself and your patient has gone wrong. Hildegard Peplau's state is that, you know, the first step we need to do, as opposed to blame the patient, call them non-compliant, difficult, etc., the first step is for us to actually examine our own behavior. So again, stop and perhaps reflect for a moment which ways of knowing would actually apply to this particular statement and philosophical perspective. Specific to Peplau's theory with regards to the nurse-client relationship, she speaks about very specific phases of this relationship. That first and foremost, there is an orientation phase where an individual has a perceived need and actually seeks professional assistance. The nurse helps the patient to recognize and understand what their problems or needs are, and collaboratively, again, that doing with, they determine, the nurse and the patient determine together what, and actually validate what is that need for help, what is the issue that needs to be addressed, what is the problem to be solved. And this is that relationship and that collaboration is developed with a sense of trust and recognizing that, again, that relationship is central, and that the parameters of that relationship are actually negotiated between the client and the nurse themselves. So this is that orientation phase. I mean, this could be, again, her background was mental health, so you could start to see this orientation phase may go over the course of several days, but in all actuality, you could actually see, for those of you that are already in practice, that this orientation phase could actually be achieved in all actuality during your initial admission assessment of a client. Why is it that what brings you here today? What is that you need some assistance with? So it's getting that orientation and developing that initial nurse-client relationship. The next phase is the working phase, where the patient identifies with the nurse or the rest of the interprofessional team who can help them, and it really attempts to take advantage of the resources that are available to them. So this is actually the orientation phase, is the identification of the need for help and some identification about what are the parameters. And the working phase is really to looking at how do we actually start to facilitate the development towards well-being, and looking at how that comes together for the client. So this is the actual working together. And the last phase is the resolution phase. Now in your text, they talk about a couple of different aspects with regards to this in terms of the different phases. So they look at in terms of, I'm just looking at the phase itself. So yeah, so on pages 70 and 71. So it's the orientation phase, the working phase, and the resolution phase. And again, you're specifically in your text, Peplau really speaks to that resolution can take place only when the patient has gained the ability to be free from nursing assistance and acting independently. So this is again the whole notion about setting that patient up for success in that working phase, based on the excellent foundational work that was done in the orientation phase, so that the patient is actually, again, able to provide self-care, to manage themselves successfully on discharge, to sustain the gains made through the support of nursing and the rest of the interprofessional team. So again, if you look at this in terms of the orientation phase, the working phase, and the resolution phase, within the context or the lens of mental health, you could start to see where this is could very well be a very long-term relationship. But again, the phases still work for those of us that you could actually see this working in day surgery, in emerge. So even start to think about what might those phases look like based on the context of care that you're involved in at this particular point in time in your own practice. When in this particular piece, I'm just going to go back here to this working phase, the nurse facilitates development towards well-being through enactment of the roles of the nurse. These are the roles of the nurse that they refer to in terms of the different 6 roles that Peplau sees as nursing roles. That number one, we are always strangers. But we look at in terms of immediately, then we start to build that sense of trust and that relationship with our patients. We are teachers. We are resource people, so we guide and navigate patients towards resources that they need. We acquire the resources that we need. We are counselors to help to understand the life experiences for individuals and provide them guidance and again, that navigation. Sometimes we can actually be surrogates to really looking at to facilitate dependence and interdependence and looking at sometimes acting on the client's behalf as an advocate. If the client is not able to advocate for themselves, we become their surrogate, we become their advocate. And we are also leaders. We help the client to assume those maximum responsibilities for meeting those treatment goals in a mutually satisfying way that enables the ability to achieve that phase of resolution where the patient can, again, function independently. This here is an example of Peplau's theory of interprofessional relationships in terms of looking at the specific phase. So here's the orientation phase. This all speaks to an older phase about exploitation, but they've now recently just kind of melded these two together. So this is a brief definition of the different phases, and this would be some of the activities of a nurse that would actually be engaged in those different stages. So this might be a way of helping you to kind of actually see this in your practice. I would also strongly suggest that you look at the practice exemplars that's on page 73 and 74, because they really give you a nice example of the various stages in action. And then perhaps as a final reflective activity, start talking about, provide an example from your area of practice and look at what those phases might actually look like in terms of how this might actually look like in nursing practice based on your current area of practice, or if you're not practicing, think about what that might look like in acute care, long-term care, community care, and all those different particular areas. So again, I really strongly suggest, again, pretend it's an exam question and sit down and think, so what would those phases actually look like in action and in practice? So that, and again, so what we'd like to do is, which of our existing CNO standards are reflective of Peplau's theory? So have a think about it again, very specifically in terms of what are the CNO guidelines that also speak to very clearly that therapeutic nurse-client relationship. And lastly, I think it's really important to look at Peplau's history. And really, she talked about looking at the modern professional nurse. And she also was the one that actually promoted the notion about nurses self-regulating, no longer being under the auspices of medicine. She also talked about the role of the advanced practice nurse, and her theory is actually used still quite regularly here today. But again, I'll say primarily in terms of researchers that are looking at the areas of mental health and looking at how do we actually continue to look at those three different phases and build on the work of Hildegard Peplau in terms of modern professional nursing. So what we were going to do was, we talked about it last week in terms of the evolution of the theory. So what I'd like you to do now is just, have a think about it. Based on the criteria they have for evaluation of theories in terms of fit, is it the clarity, is it logical, and can the theory used in practice, how would you rate or evaluate these particular theories in terms of Nightingale and Peplau? And then we'll pick that up when we come back together again next week. So here's your reflective question for today. I've loaded it under the week 3 folder as an assignment tab. You are free to do this at any point in time between as soon as you access this particular audio cast. But my expectation is, as I clearly stated, that the reflections are to be completed no later than 4 o'clock on Monday, just as if we were in class. So I hope you found this helpful. And again, I do apologize for missing our time together, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good one. Bye.